How the Brigadier took the field against the Marshal Millefleurs. Massena was a thin, sour little fellow, and after his hunting accident he had only one eye. But when it looked out from under his cocked hat, there was not much upon a field of battle which escaped it. He could stand in front of a battalion and with a single sweep tell you if a buckle or a gaiter button were out of place. Neither the officers nor the men were very fond of him, for he was, as you know, a miser, and soldiers loved that their leaders should be free-handed. At the same time, when it came to work, they had a very high respect for him, and they would rather fight under him than under anyone, except the Emperor himself, and Lannes when he was alive. After all, if he had a tight grasp upon his money-bags, there was a day also, you must remember, when that same grip was upon Zurich and Genoa. He clutched on to his positions as he did to his strong-box, and it took a very clever man to loosen him from either. When I received his summons, I went gladly to his headquarters, for I was always a great favourite of his, and there was no officer of whom he thought more highly. That was the best of serving with those good old generals, that they knew enough to be able to pick out a fine soldier when they saw one. He was seated alone in his tent, with his chin upon his hand, and his brow as wrinkled as if he had been asked for a subscription. He smiled, however, when he saw me before him. "Good day, Colonel Gerard." "Good day, Marshal. How is the 3rd of Hussars?" 700 incomparable men upon 700 excellent horses. And your wounds, are they healed?" "My wounds never heal, Marshal," I answered. "And why?" "Because I have always new ones." "General Rapp must look to his laurels," said he, his face all breaking into wrinkles as he laughed. "He has had 21 from the enemy's bullets, and as many from Larry's knives and probes. Knowing that you were hurt, Colonel, I have spared you of late, which hurt me most of all. Tut, tut, since the English got behind these accursed lines of Torres Vedras, there has been little for us to do. You did not miss much during your imprisonment at Dartmoor. But now we are on the eve of action. We advance? No, retire." My face must have shown my dismay. What, retire before this sacred dog of a Wellington? He who had listened unmoved to my words, and had sent me to his land of fogs. I could have sobbed as I thought of it. "What would you have?" cried Massena impatiently. "When one is in check, it is necessary to move the king." "Forwards," I suggested. He shook his grizzled head. "The lines are not to be forced," said he. "I have already lost General St. Croix, and more men than I can replace. On the other hand, we have been here at Saint-Arem for nearly 6 months. There is not a pound of flour nor a jug of wine on the countryside. We must retire." "There are flour and wine in Lisbon," I persisted. "Tut, you speak as if an army could charge in and charge out again, like your regiment of hussars. If Soult were here, with 30,000 men, but he will not come. I sent for you, however, Colonel Gerard, to say that I have a very singular and important expedition which I intend to place under your direction." I pricked up my ears, as you can imagine. The Marshal unrolled a great map of the country and spread it upon the table. He flattened it out with his little hairy hands. "This is Saint-Arem," he said, pointing. I nodded. "And here, 25 miles to the east, is Marshal, celebrated for its vintages and for its enormous abbey." Again I nodded. I could not think what was coming. "Have you heard of the Marshal Millefleurs?" asked Massena. "I have served with all the marshals," said I, "but there is none of that name." "It is but the nickname which the soldiers have given him," said Massena. "If you had not been away from us for some months, it would not be necessary for me to tell you about him. He is an Englishman, and a man of good breeding. It is on account of his manners that they have given him his title. I wish you to go to this polite Englishman at Marshal." "Yes, Marshal." "And to hang him to the nearest tree." "Certainly, Marshal." I turned briskly upon my heels, but Masséna recalled me before I could reach the opening of his tent. "One moment, Colonel," said he. "You had best learn how matters stand before you start. You must know, then, that this Marshal Millefleurs, whose real name is Alexis Morgan, is a man of very great ingenuity and bravery. He was an officer in the English Guards, but having been broken for cheating at cards, he left the army. In some manner he gathered a number of English deserters round him and took to the mountains. French stragglers and Portuguese brigands joined him, and he found himself at the head of 500 men. With these he took possession of the abbey of Marshal, sent the monks about their business, fortified the place, and gathered in the plunder of all the country round." "For which it is high time he was hanged," said I, making once more for the door. "One instant!" cried the Marshal, smiling at my impatience. "The worst remains behind. Only last week the Dowager Countess of La Ronda, the richest woman in Spain, was taken by these ruffians in the passes as she was journeying from King Joseph's court to visit her grandson. She is now a prisoner in the abbey, and is only protected by her grandmotherhood, I suggested. "Her power of paying a ransom," said Masséna. "You have 3 missions, then: to rescue this unfortunate lady, to punish this villain, and, if possible, to break up this nest of brigands. It will be a proof of the confidence which I have in you when I say that I can only spare you half a squadron with which to accomplish all this." My word, I could hardly believe my ears. I thought that I should have had my regiment at the least. "I would give you more," said he, "but I commence my retreat today, and Wellington is so strong in horse that every trooper becomes of importance. I cannot spare you another man. You will see what you can do, and you will report yourself to me at Abrantes not later than tomorrow night." It was very complimentary that he should rate my powers so high, but it was also a little embarrassing. I was to rescue an old lady, to hang an Englishman, and to break up a band of 500 assassins, all with 50 men. But, after all, the 50 men were hussars of Conflans, and they had an Brigadier Gerard to lead them. As I came out into the warm Portuguese sunshine, my confidence had returned to me, and I had already begun to wonder whether the medal which I had so often deserved might not be waiting for me at Marshal. You may be sure that I did not take my 50 men at haphazard. They were all old soldiers of the German wars, some of them with 3 stripes, and most of them with 2. Ude and Papilette, 2 of the best sub-officers in the regiment, were at their head. When I had them formed up in 4s, all in silver grey and upon chestnut horses with their leopard-skin shabracks and their little red panaches, my heart beat high at the sight. I could not look at their weather-stained faces, with the great moustaches which bristled over their chin-straps, without feeling a glow of confidence. And between ourselves, I have no doubt that that was exactly how they felt when they saw their young colonel on his great black war-horse riding at their head. Well, when we got free of the camp and over the Tagus, I threw out my advance and my flankers, keeping my own place at the head of the main body. Looking back from the hills above Saint-Arène, we could see the dark lines of Masséna's army, with the flash and twinkle of the sabres and bayonets, as he moved his regiments into position for their retreat. To the south lay the scattered red patches of the English outposts, and behind the grey smoke cloud which rose from Wellington's camp, thick, oily smoke, which seemed to our poor starving fellows to bear with it the rich smell of seething camp kettles. Away to the west lay a curve of blue sea, flecked with the white sails of the English ships. You will understand that as we were riding to the east, our road lay away from both armies. Our own marauders, however, and the scouting parties of the English covered the country, and it was necessary with my small troop that I should take every precaution. During the whole day we rode over desolate hillsides, the lower portions covered by the budding vines, but the upper turning from green to grey and jagged along the skyline like the back of a starved horse. Mountain streams crossed our path, running west to the Tagus, and once we came to a deep, strong river, which might have checked us had I not found the ford by observing where houses had been built opposite each other upon either bank. Between them, as every scout should know, you will find your ford. There was none to give us information, for neither man nor beast nor any living thing except great clouds of crows was to be seen during our journey. The sun was beginning to sink when we came to a valley clear in the centre, but shrouded by huge oak trees upon either side. We could not be more than a few miles from Marshal, so it seemed to me to be best to keep among the groves, for the spring had been an early one, and the leaves were already thick enough to conceal us. We were riding then in open order among the great trunks, when one of my flankers came galloping up. "There are English across the valley, Colonel," he cried as he saluted. "Cavalry or infantry?" "Dragoons, Colonel," said he. "I saw the gleam of their helmets and heard the neigh of a horse." Halting my men, I hastened to the edge of the wood. There could be no doubt about it. A party of English cavalry was travelling in a line with us, and in the same direction. I caught a glimpse of their red coats, and of their flashing arms glowing and twinkling among the tree trunks. Once, as they passed through a small clearing, I could see their whole force, and I judged that they were of about the same strength as my own, a half-squadron at the most. You who have heard some of my little adventures will give me credit for being quick in my decisions and prompt in carrying them out. But here I must confess that I was in two minds. On the one hand, there was the chance of a fine cavalry skirmish with the English. On the other hand, there was my mission at the Abbey of Marshal, which seemed already to be so much above my power. If I were to lose any of my men, it was certain that I should be unable to carry out my orders. I was sitting my horse, with my chin in my gauntlet, looking across at the rippling gleams of light from the further wood, when suddenly one of these red-coated Englishmen rode out from the cover, pointing at me and breaking into a shrill whoop and hallo, as if I had been a fox. 3 others joined him, and one who was a bugler sounded a call, which brought the whole of them into the open. They were, as I had thought, a half-squadron, and they formed a double line, with a front of 25. Their officer, the one who had whooped at me, at their head. For my own part, I had instantly brought my own troopers into the same formation, so that there we were, hussars and dragoons, with only 200 yards of grassy sward between us. They carried themselves well, those red-coated troopers, with their silver helmets, their high white plumes, and their long gleaming swords, while, on the other hand, I am sure that they would acknowledge that they had never looked upon finer light horsemen than the 50 hussars of Conflans who were facing them. They were heavier, it is true, and they may have seemed the smarter, for Wellington used to make them burnish their metalwork, which was not usual among us. On the other hand, it is well known that the English tunics were too tight for the sword-arm, which gave our men an advantage. As to bravery, foolish, inexperienced people of every nation always think that their own soldiers are braver than any others. There is no nation in the world which does not entertain this idea. But when one has seen as much as I have done, one understands that there is no very marked difference, and that although nations differ very much in discipline, they are all equally brave, except that the French have rather more courage than the rest. Well, the cork was drawn and the glasses ready, when suddenly the English officer raised his sword to me as if in a challenge, and cantered his horse across the grassland. My word, there is no finer sight upon earth than that of a gallant man upon a gallant steed. I could have halted there just to watch him, as he came with such careless grace, his sabre down by his horse's shoulder, his head thrown back, his white plume tossing, youth and strength and courage, with the violet evening sky above and the oak trees behind. But it was not for me to stand and stare. Etienne Gerard may have his faults, but my faith, he was never accused of being backward in taking his own part. The old horse, Rataplan, knew me so well that he had started off before ever I gave the first shake to the bridle. There are two things in this world that I am very slow to forget: the face of a pretty woman and the legs of a fine horse. Well, as we drew together, I kept on saying, "Where have I seen those great roan shoulders? Where have I seen that dainty fetlock?" Then suddenly I remembered, and as I looked up at the reckless eyes and the challenging smile, whom should I recognize but the man who had saved me from the brigands and played me for my freedom, he whose correct title was Milord the Honourable Sir Russell Bart. "Bart!" I shouted. He had his arm raised for a cut, and 3 parts of his body open to my point, for he did not know very much about the use of the sword. As I brought my hilt to the salute, he dropped his hand and stared at me. "Hello," said he, "it's Gerard." You would have thought by his manner that I had met him by appointment. For my own part, I would have embraced him, had he but come an inch of the way to meet me. "I thought we were in for some sport," said he. "I never dreamed that it was you." I found this tone of disappointment somewhat irritating. Instead of being glad at having met a friend, he was sorry at having missed an enemy. "I should have been happy to join you in your sport, my dear Bart," said I, "but I really cannot turn my sword upon a man who saved my life." "Tut, never mind about that." "No, it is impossible. I should never forgive myself. You make too much of a trifle. My mother's one desire is to embrace you. If ever you should be in Gascony, Lord Wellington is coming there with 60,000 men. "Then one of them will have a chance of surviving," said I, laughing. "In the meantime, put your sword in your sheath." Our horses were standing head to tail, and the Bart put out his hand and patted me on the thigh. "You're a good chap, Gerard," said he. "I only wish you had been born on the right side of the Channel." "I was," said I. "Poor devil!" he cried, with such an earnestness of pity that he set me laughing again. "But look here, Gerard," he continued, "this is all very well, but it is not business, you know. I don't know what Massena would say to it, but our chief would jump out of his riding boots if he saw us. We weren't sent out here for a picnic, either of us." "What would you have?" "Well, we had a little argument about our hussars and dragoons, if you remember. I've got 50 of the 16th, all chewing their carbine bullets, behind me. You've got as many fine-looking boys over yonder, who seem to be fidgeting in their saddles. If you and I took the right flanks, we should not spoil each other's beauty, though a little blood-letting is a friendly thing in this climate." There seemed to me to be a good deal of sense in what he said. For the moment, Mr. Alexis Morgan and the Countess of La Ronda and the Abbey of Alméchal went right out of my head, and I could only think of the fine level turf and of the beautiful skirmish which we might have. "Very good, Bart," said I. "We have seen the front of your dragoons. We shall now have a look at their backs." "Any betting?" he asked. "The stake," said I, "is nothing less than the honour of the Hussars of Conflans." "Well, come on," he answered. "If we break you, well and good. If you break us, it will be all the better for Marshal Millefleurs." When he said that, I could only stare at him in astonishment. "Why for Marshal Millefleurs?" I asked. "It is the name of a rascal who lives out this way. My dragoons have been sent by Lord Wellington to see him safely hanged." "Name of a name!" I cried. "Why, my hussars have been sent by Massena for that very object." We burst out laughing at that, and sheathed our swords. there was a whir of steel from behind us, as our troopers followed our example. "We are allies," he cried, "for a day. We must join forces, there is no doubt of it." And so instead of fighting, we wheeled our half-squadrons round and moved in two little columns down the valley, the shakos and the helmets turned inwards, and the men looking their neighbours up and down like old fighting dogs with tattered ears, who have learned to respect each other's teeth. The most were on the broad grin, but there were some on either side who looked black and challenging, especially the English sergeant and my own sub-officer, Papilette. They were men of habit, you see, who could not all change their ways of thinking in a moment. Besides, Papilette had lost his only brother at Busaco. As for the Bart and me, we rode together at the head, and chatted about all that had occurred to us since that famous game of écarté, of which I've told you. For my own part, I spoke to him of my adventures in England. They're very singular people, these English. Although he knew that I'd been engaged in 12 campaigns, yet I'm sure that the Bart thought more highly of me because I had had an affair with the Bristol bustler. He told me, too, that the colonel, who presided over his court-martial for playing cards with a prisoner, acquitted him of neglect of duty, but nearly broke him because he thought that he had not cleared his trumps before leading his suit. Yes, indeed, they are a singular people. At the end of the valley, the road curved over some rising ground, before winding down into another, wider valley beyond. We called a halt when we came to the top, for there, right in front of us, at the distance of about 3 miles, was a scattered grey town, with a single enormous building upon the flank of the mountain, which overlooked it. We could not doubt that we were at last in sight of the abbey that held the gang of rascals whom we had come to disperse. It was only now, I think, that we fully understood what a task lay in front of us, for the place was a veritable fortress, and it was evident that cavalry should never have been sent out upon such an errand. "That's got nothing to do with us," said the Bart. "Wellington and Massena can settle that between them." "Courage," I answered. "Piré took Leipzig with 50 hussars." "Had they been dragoons," said the Bart, laughing, "he would have had Berlin. But you are senior officer. Give us a lead, and we'll see who will be the first to flinch." "Well," said I, "whatever we do must be done at once, for my orders are to be on my way to Abrantes by tomorrow night. But we must have some information first, and here is someone who should be able to give it to us." There was a square, whitewashed house standing by the roadside, which appeared, from the bush hanging over the door, to be one of those wayside tabernas which are provided for the muleteers. A lantern was hung in the porch, and by its light we saw 2 men, the one in the brown habit of a Capuchin monk, and the other girt with an apron, which showed him to be the landlord. They were conversing together so earnestly that we were upon them before they were aware of us. The innkeeper turned to fly, but one of the Englishmen seized him by the hair and held him tight. "For mercy's sake, spare me," he yelled. "My house has been gutted by the French and harried by the English, and my feet have been burned by the brigands. I swear by the Virgin that I have neither money nor food in my inn, and the good Father Abbot, who is starving upon my doorstep, will be witness to it." "Indeed, sir," said the Capuchin, in excellent French, "what this worthy man says is very true. He is one of the many victims to these cruel wars, although his loss is but a featherweight compared to mine. Let him go," he added in English to the trooper. "He is too weak to fly, even if he desired to." In the light of the lantern I saw that this monk was a magnificent man, dark and bearded, with the eyes of a hawk, and so tall that his cowl came up to Rataplan's ears. He wore the look of one who had been through much suffering, but he carried himself like a king, and we could form some opinion of his learning when we each heard him talk our own language as fluently as if he were born to it. "You have nothing to fear," said I to the trembling innkeeper. "As to you, father, you are, if I am not mistaken, the very man who can give us the information which we require. All that I have is at your service, my son. But," he added, with a wan smile, "my Lenten fare is always somewhat meagre, and this year it has been such that I must ask you for a crust of bread, if I am to have the strength to answer your questions." We bore 2 days' rations in our haversacks, so that he soon had the little he asked for. It was dreadful to see the wolfish way in which he seized the piece of dried goat's flesh which I was able to offer him. "Time presses, and we must come to the point," said I. "We want your advice as to the weak points of yonder abbey, and concerning the habits of the rascals who infest it." He cried out something which I took to be Latin, with his hands clasped and his eyes upturned. "The prayer of the just availeth much," said he, "and yet I had not dared to hope that mine would have been so speedily answered. In me you see the unfortunate abbot of Marshal, who has been cast out by this rabble of 3 armies, with their heretical leader. Oh, to think of what I have lost!" His voice broke, and the tears hung upon his lashes. "Cheer up, sir," said the Bart. "I'll lay 9 to 4 that we have you back again by tomorrow night." "It is not of my own welfare that I think," said he, "nor even of that of my poor scattered flock, but it is of the holy relics which are left in the sacrilegious hands of these robbers." "It's even betting whether they would ever bother their heads about them," said the Bart. "But show us the way inside the gates, and we'll soon clear the place out for you." In a few short words the good abbot gave us the very points that we wished to know. But all that he said only made our task more formidable. The walls of the abbey were 40 feet high, the lower windows were barricaded, and the whole building loopholed for musketry fire. The gang preserved military discipline, and their sentries were too numerous for us to hope to take them by surprise. It was more than ever evident that a battalion of grenadiers and a couple of breaching pieces were what was needed. I raised my eyebrows, and the Bart began to whistle. "We must have a shot of it, come what may," said he. The men had already dismounted, and, having watered their horses, were eating their suppers. For my own part, I went into the sitting-room of the inn with the abbot and the Bart, that we might talk about our plans. I had a little cognac in my sauve-vie, and I divided it among us, just enough to wet our moustaches. "It is unlikely," said I, "that those rascals know anything about our coming. I have seen no signs of scouts along the road. My own plan is that we should conceal ourselves in some neighbouring wood, and then, when they open their gates, charge down upon them and take them by surprise." The Bart was of opinion that this was the best that we could do, but when we came to talk it over, the abbot made us see that there were difficulties in the way. "Save on the side of the town, there is no place within a mile of the abbey where you could shelter man or horse," said he. "As to the townsfolk, they are not to be trusted. I fear, my son, that your excellent plan would have little chance of success in the face of the vigilant guard which these men keep." "I see no other way," answered I. "Hussars of Conflans are not so plentiful that I can afford to run half a squadron of them against a 40-foot wall, with 500 infantry behind it." "I am a man of peace," said the abbot, "and yet I may, perhaps, give a word of counsel. I know these villains and their ways. Who should do so better, seeing that I have stayed for a month in this lonely spot, looking down in weariness of heart at the abbey which was my own? I will tell you now what I should myself do if I were in your place." "Pray tell us, father," we cried both together. "You must know that bodies of deserters, both French and English, are continually coming into them, carrying their weapons with them. Now, what is there to prevent you and your men from pretending to be such a body, and so making your way into the abbey?" I was amazed at the simplicity of the thing, and I embraced the good abbot. The Bart, however, had some objections to offer. "That is all very well," said he, "but if these fellows are as sharp as you say, it is not very likely that they are going to let 100 armed strangers into their crib. From all I have heard of Mr. Morgan, or Marshal Millefleurs, or whatever the rascal's name is, I give him credit for more sense than that." "Well, then," I cried, "let us send 50 in, and let them at daybreak throw open the gates to the other 50 who will be waiting outside." We discussed the question at great length, and with much foresight and discretion. If it had been Massena and Wellington instead of 2 young officers of light cavalry, we could not have weighed it all with more judgment. At last we agreed, the Bart and I, that one of us should indeed go with 50 men, under pretence of being deserters, and that in the early morning he should gain command of the gate and admit the others. The abbot, it is true, was still of opinion that it was dangerous to divide our force, but finding that we were both of the same mind, he shrugged his shoulders and gave in. "There is only one thing that I would ask," said he. "If you lay hands upon this Marshal Millefleurs, this dog of a brigand, what will you do with him?" "Hang him," I answered. "It is too easy a death," cried the Capuchin, with a vindictive glow in his dark eyes. "Had I my way with him. But oh, what thoughts are these for a servant of God to harbour?" He clapped his hands to his forehead, like one who is half demented by his troubles, and rushed out of the room. There was an important point which we had still to settle, and that was whether the French or the English party should have the honour of entering the abbey first. My faith, it was asking a great deal of Brigadier Gerard that he should give place to any man at such a time. But the poor Bart pleaded so hard, urging the few skirmishes which he had seen against my 74 engagements, that at last I consented that he should go. We had just clasped hands over the matter when there broke out such a shouting and cursing and yelling from the front of the inn that out we rushed with our drawn sabres in our hands, convinced that the brigands were upon us. You may imagine our feelings when, by the light of the lantern which hung from the porch, we saw a score of our hussars and dragoons all mixed in one wild heap, redcoats and blue, helmets and busbies, pommelling each other to their heart's content. We flung ourselves upon them, imploring, threatening, tugging at a lace collar or at a spurred heel, until, at last, we had dragged them all apart. There they stood, flushed and bleeding, glaring at each other, and all panting together like a line of troop horses after a 10-mile chase. It was only with our drawn swords that we could keep them from each other's throats. The poor Capuchin stood in the porch in his long brown habit, wringing his hands and calling upon all the saints for mercy. He was, indeed, as I found upon inquiry, the innocent cause of all the turmoil, for, not understanding how soldiers look upon such things, he had made some remark to the English sergeant that it was a pity that his squadron was not as good as the French. The words were not out of his mouth before a dragoon knocked down the nearest hussar, and then, in a moment, they all flew at each other like tigers. We would trust them no more after that. But the Bart moved his men to the front of the inn, and I mine to the back, the English all scowling and silent, and our fellows shaking their fists and chattering, each after the fashion of their own people. Well, as our plans were made, we thought it best to carry them out at once, lest some fresh cause of quarrel should break out between our followers. The Bart and his men rode off, therefore, he having first torn the lace from his sleeves, and the gorget and sash from his uniform, so that he might pass as a simple trooper. He explained to his men what it was that was expected of them, and though they did not raise a cry or wave their weapons, as mine might have done, there was an expression upon their stolid and clean-shaven faces which filled me with confidence. Their tunics were left unbuttoned, their scabbards and helmets stained with dirt, and their harness badly fastened, so that they might look the part of deserters without order or discipline. At 6 o'clock next morning they were to gain command of the main gate of the abbey, while at that same hour my hussars were to gallop up to it from outside. The Bart and I pledged our words to it before he trotted off with his detachment. My sergeant, Papilette, with 2 troopers, followed the English at a distance, and returned in half an hour to say that, after some parley, and the flashing of lanterns upon them from the grille, they had been admitted into the abbey. So far, then, all had gone well. It was a cloudy night, with a sprinkling of rain, which was in our favour, as there was the less chance of our presence being discovered. My vedettes I placed 200 yards in every direction, to guard against a surprise, and also to prevent any peasant who might stumble upon us from carrying the news to the abbey. Oudin and Papilette were to take turns of duty, while the others with their horses had snug quarters in the great wooden granary. Having walked round and seen that all was as it should be, I flung myself upon the bed which the innkeeper had set apart for me, and fell into a dreamless sleep. No doubt you have heard my name mentioned as being the beau ideal of a soldier, and that not only by friends and admirers like our fellow townsfolk, but also by old officers of the great wars who have shared the fortunes of those famous campaigns with me. Truth and modesty compel me to say, however, that this is not so. There are some gifts which I lack, very few, no doubt, but still, amid the vast armies of the Emperor, there may have been some who were free from those blemishes which stood between me and perfection. Of bravery I say nothing. Those who have seen me in the field are best fitted to speak about that. I have often heard the soldiers discussing round the campfires as to who was the bravest man in the Grand Army. Some say Murat, and some said Lasalle, and some Ney. But for my own part, when they asked me, I merely shrugged my shoulders and smiled. It would have seemed mere conceit if I had answered that there was no man braver than Brigadier Gerard. At the same time, facts are facts, and a man knows best what his own feelings are. But there are other gifts besides bravery which are necessary for a soldier, and one of them is that he should be a light sleeper. Now, from my boyhood onwards, I have been hard to wake, and it was this which brought me to ruin upon that night. It may have been about 2 o'clock in the morning that I was suddenly conscious of a feeling of suffocation. I tried to call out, but there was something which prevented me from uttering a sound. I struggled to rise, but I could only flounder like a hamstrung horse. I was strapped at the ankles, strapped at the knees, and strapped again at the wrists. Only my eyes were free to move. And there, at the foot of my couch, by the light of a Portuguese lamp, whom should I see but the abbot and the innkeeper? The latter's heavy white face had appeared to me, when I looked upon it the evening before, to express nothing but stupidity and terror. Now, on the contrary, every feature bespoke brutality and ferocity. Never have I seen a more dreadful-looking villain. In his hand he held a long, dull-coloured knife. The abbot, on the other hand, was as polished and as dignified as ever. His capuchin gown had been thrown open, however, and I saw beneath it a black frogged coat, such as I have seen among the English officers. As our eyes met, he leaned over the wooden end of the bed and laughed silently until it creaked again. "You will, I am sure, excuse my mirth, my dear Colonel Gerard," said he. "The fact is that the expression upon your face when you grasped the situation was just a little funny. I have no doubt that you are an excellent soldier, but I hardly think that you are fit to measure wits with the Marshal Millefleurs, as your fellows have been good enough to call me. You appear to have given me credit for singularly little intelligence, which argues, if I may be allowed to say so, a want of acuteness upon your own part. Indeed, with the single exception of my thick-headed compatriot, the British dragoon, I have never met anyone who was less competent to carry out such a mission. You can imagine how I felt and how I looked as I listened to this insolent harangue, which was all delivered in that flowery and condescending manner which had gained this rascal his nickname. I could say nothing, but they must have read my threat in my eyes, for the fellow who had played the part of the innkeeper whispered something to his companion. "No, no, my dear Chenier, he will be infinitely more valuable alive," said he. "By the way, Colonel, it is just as well that you are a sound sleeper, for my friend here, who is a little rough in his ways, would certainly have cut your throat if you had raised any alarm. I should recommend you to keep in his good graces, for Sergeant Chenier, late of the 7th Imperial Light Infantry, is a much more dangerous person than Captain Alexis Morgan of His Majesty's Foot Guards." Chenier grinned and shook his knife at me, while I tried to look the loathing which I felt at the thought that a soldier of the Emperor could fall so low. "It may amuse you to know," said the Marshal in that soft, suave voice of his, "that both your expeditions were watched from the time that you left your respective camps. I think that you will allow that Chenier and I played our parts with some subtlety. We had made every arrangement for your reception at the Abbey, though we had hoped to receive the whole squadron instead of half. When the gates are secured behind them, our visitors will find themselves in a very charming little medieval quadrangle, with no possible exit, commanded by musketry fire from 100 windows. They may choose to be shot down, or they may choose to surrender. Between ourselves, I have not the slightest doubt that they have been wise enough to do the latter. But since you are naturally interested in the matter, we thought that you would care to come with us and to see for yourself. I think I can promise you that you will find your titled friend waiting for you at the Abbey with a face as long as your own." The two villains began whispering together, debating, as far as I could hear, which was the best way of avoiding my vedettes. "I will make sure that it is all clear upon the other side of the barn," said the Marshal at last. "You will stay here, my good Chenier, and if the prisoner gives any trouble, you will know what to do." So we were left together, this murderous renegade and I, he sitting at the end of the bed, sharpening his knife upon his boot in the light of the single smoky little oil lamp. As to me, I only wonder now, as I look back upon it, that I did not go mad with vexation and self-reproach as I lay helplessly upon the couch, unable to utter a word or move a finger, with the knowledge that my 50 gallant lads were so close to me, and yet with no means of letting them know the straits to which I was reduced. It was no new thing for me to be a prisoner, but to be taken by these renegades, and to be led into their abbey in the midst of their jeers, befooled and outwitted by their insolent leaders, that was indeed more than I could endure. The knife of the butcher beside me would cut less deeply than that. I twitched softly at my wrists and then at my ankles, but whichever of the two had secured me was no bungler at his work. I could not move either of them an inch. Then I tried to work the handkerchief down over my mouth, but the ruffian beside me raised his knife with such a threatening snarl that I had to desist. I was lying still, looking at his bull neck, and wondering whether it would ever be my good fortune to fit it for a cravat, when I heard returning steps coming down the inn passage and up the stair. What word would the villain bring back? If he found it impossible to kidnap me, he would probably murder me where I lay. For my own part, I was indifferent which it might be, and I looked at the doorway with the contempt and defiance which I longed to put into words. But you can imagine my feelings, my dear friends, when instead of the tall figure and dark sneering face of the Capuchin, my eyes fell upon the grey pelisse and huge moustaches of my good little sub-officer, Papilette. The French soldier of those days had seen too much to be ever taken by surprise. His eyes had hardly rested upon my bound figure and the sinister face beside me before he had seen how the matter lay. "Sacred name of a dog," he growled, and out flashed his great sabre. Chenier sprang forward at him with his knife, and then, thinking better of it, he darted back and stabbed frantically at my heart. For my own part, I had hurled myself off the bed on the side opposite to him, and the blade grazed my side, before ripping its way through blanket and sheet. An instant later I heard the thud of a heavy fall, and almost simultaneously a second object struck the floor, something lighter but harder, which rolled under the bed. I will not horrify you with details, my friends. Suffice it that Papilette was one of the strongest swordsmen in the regiment, and that his sabre was heavy and sharp. It left a red blotch upon my wrists and my ankles, as it cut the thongs which bound me. When I had thrown off my gag, the first use which I made of my lips was to kiss the sergeant's scarred cheeks. The next was to ask him if all was well with the command. Yes, they had had no alarms. Oudin had just relieved him, and he had come to report. Had he seen the abbot? No, he had seen nothing of him. Then we must form a cordon and prevent his escape. I was hurrying out to give the orders when I heard a slow and measured step enter the door below and come creaking up the stairs. Papilette understood it all in an instant. "You are not to kill him," I whispered, and thrust him into the shadow on one side of the door. I crouched on the other. Up he came, up, and every footfall seemed to be upon my heart. The brown skirt of his gown was not over the threshold before we were both on him like two wolves on a buck. Down we crashed, the three of us, he fighting like a tiger, and with such amazing strength that he might have broken away from the two of us. Thrice he got to his feet, and thrice we had him over again, until Papilette made him feel that there was a point to his sabre. He had sense enough then to know that the game was up, and to lie still, while I lashed him with the very cords which had been round my own limbs. "There has been a fresh deal, my fine fellow," said I, "and you will find that I have some of the trumps in my hand this time." "Luck always comes to the aid of a fool," he answered. "Perhaps it is as well, otherwise the world would fall too completely into the power of the astute. So you have killed Chenier, I see. He was an insubordinate dog, and always smelled abominably of garlic. Might I trouble you to lay me upon the bed? The floor of these Portuguese tabernas is hardly a fitting couch for anyone who has prejudices in favour of cleanliness." I could not but admire the coolness of the man, and the way in which he preserved the same insolent air of condescension in spite of this sudden turning of the tables. I dispatched Papilette to summon a guard, whilst I stood over our prisoner with my drawn sword, never taking my eyes off him for an instant. For I must confess that I had conceived a great respect for his audacity and resource. "I trust," said he, "that your men will treat me in a becoming manner. You will get your deserts, you may depend upon that. I ask nothing more. You may not be aware of my exalted birth, but I am so placed that I cannot name my father without treason, nor my mother without a scandal. I cannot claim royal honours, but these things are so much more graceful when they are conceded without a claim. The thongs are cutting my skin. Might I beg you to loosen them?" "You do not give me credit for much intelligence," I remarked, repeating his own words. "Touché!" he cried, like a pinked fencer. "But here come your men, so it matters little whether you loosen them or not." I ordered the gown to be stripped from him, and placed him under a strong guard. Then, as morning was already breaking, I had to consider what my next step was to be. The poor Bart and his Englishmen had fallen victims to the deep scheme which might, had we adopted all the crafty suggestions of our adviser, have ended in the capture of the whole instead of the half of our force. I must extricate them, if it were still possible. Then there was the old lady, the Countess of La Ronda, to be thought of. As to the abbey, since its garrison was on the alert, it was hopeless to think of capturing that. All turned now upon the value which they placed upon their leader. The game depended upon my playing that one card. I will tell you how boldly and how skilfully I played it. It was hardly light before my bugler blew the assembly, and out we trotted onto the plain. My prisoner was placed on horseback in the very centre of the troops. It chanced that there was a large tree just out of musket shot from the main gate of the abbey, and under this we halted. Had they opened the great doors in order to attack us, I should have charged home upon them. But, as I had expected, they stood upon the defensive, lining the long wall, and pouring down a torrent of hootings and taunts and derisive laughter upon us. A few fired their muskets, but finding that we were out of reach, they soon ceased to waste their powder. It was the strangest sight to see that mixture of uniforms, French, English, and Portuguese, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, all wagging their heads and shaking their fists at us. My word, their hubbub soon died away when we opened our ranks and showed whom we had got in the midst of us. There was silence for a few seconds, and then such a howl of rage and grief. I could see some of them dancing like madmen upon the wall. He must have been a singular person, this prisoner of ours, to have gained the affection of such a gang. I had brought a rope from the inn, and we slung it over the lower bough of the tree. "You will permit me, monsieur, to undo your collar," said Papilette with mock politeness. "If your hands are perfectly clean," answered our prisoner, and set the whole half-squadron laughing. There was another yell from the wall, followed by a profound hush, as the noose was tightened round Marshal Millefleurs' neck. Then came a shriek from a bugle, the abbey gates flew open, and 3 men rushed out, waving white cloths in their hands. Ah, how my heart bounded with joy at the sight of them! And yet I would not advance an inch to meet them, so that all the eagerness might seem to be upon their side. I allowed my trumpeter, however, to wave a handkerchief in reply, upon which the 3 envoys came running towards us. The Marshal, still pinioned, and with the rope round his neck, sat his horse with a half-smile, as one who is slightly bored, and yet strives out of courtesy not to show it. If I were in such a situation, I could not wish to carry myself better, and surely I can say no more than that. They were a singular trio, these ambassadors. The one was a Portuguese caçador in his dark uniform, the second a French chasseur in the lightest green, and the third a big English artilleryman in blue and gold. They saluted all 3, and the Frenchman did the talking. "We have 37 English dragoons in our hands," said he. "We give you our most solemn oath that they shall all hang from the abbey wall within 5 minutes of the death of our Marshal." 37, I cried. "You have 51. 14 were cut down before they could be secured." "And the officer?" "He would not surrender his sword, save with his life. It was not our fault. We would have saved him if we could. Alas for my poor Bart! I had met him but twice, and yet he was a man very much after my heart. I've always had a regard for the English, for the sake of that one friend. A braver man and a worse swordsman I have never met. I did not, as you may think, take these rascals' word for anything. Papilette was dispatched with one of them, and returned to say that it was too true. I had now to think of the living. You will release the 37 dragoons if I free your leader? We will give you 10 of them. Up with him, I cried. 20, shouted the chasseur. No more words, said I. Pull on the rope. All of them, cried the envoy, as the cord tightened round the marshal's neck. With horses and arms? They could see that I was not a man to jest with. All complete, said the chasseur sulkily. And the Countess of La Ronde as well, said I. But here I met with firmer opposition. No threats of mine could induce them to give up the Countess. We tightened the cord. We moved the horse. We did all but leave the Marshal suspended. If once I broke his neck, the dragoons were dead men. It was as precious to me as to them. "Allow me to remark," said the Marshal blandly, "that you are exposing me to a risk of a quinsy. Do you not think, since there is a difference of opinion upon this point, that it would be an excellent idea to consult the lady herself? We would neither of us, I am sure, wish to override her own inclinations." Nothing could be more satisfactory. You can imagine how quickly I grasped at so simple a solution. In 10 minutes she was before us, a most stately dame, with her grey curls peeping out from under her mantilla. Her face was as yellow as though it reflected the countless doubloons of her treasury. "This gentleman," said the Marshal, "is exceedingly anxious to convey you to a place where you will never see us more. It is for you to decide whether you would wish to go with him, or whether you prefer to remain with me." She was at his horse's side in an instant. "My own Alexis," she cried, "nothing can ever part us." He looked at me with a sneer upon his handsome face. "By the way, you made a small slip of the tongue, my dear Colonel," said he. "Except by courtesy, no such person exists as the Dowager Countess of La Ronde. The lady whom I have the honour to present to you is my very dear wife, Mrs. Alexis Morgan. Or shall I say, Madame la Maréchale Millefleurs?" It was at this moment that I came to the conclusion that I was dealing with the cleverest and also the most unscrupulous man whom I had ever met. As I looked upon this unfortunate old woman, my soul was filled with wonder and disgust. As for her, her eyes were raised to his face with such a look as a young recruit might give to the Emperor. "So be it," said I at last. "Give me the dragoons, and let me go." They were brought out with their horses and weapons, and the rope was taken from the Marshal's neck. "Goodbye, my dear Colonel," said he. "I am afraid that you will have rather a lame account to give of your mission when you find your way back to Messina. Though, from all I hear, he will probably be too busy to think of you. I am free to confess that you have extricated yourself from your difficulties with greater ability than I had given you credit for. I presume that there is nothing which I can do for you before you go?" "There is one thing." "And that is?" "To give fitting burial to this young officer and his men." "I pledge my word to it." "And there is one other." "Name it." "To give me 5 minutes in the open, with a sword in your hand and a horse between your legs." "Tut, tut," said he. "I should either have to cut short your promising career, or else bid adieu to my own bonny bride. It is unreasonable to ask such a request of a man in the first joys of matrimony." I gathered my horsemen together and wheeled them into column. "Au revoir," I cried, shaking my sword at him. "The next time you may not escape so easily." "Au revoir," he answered. "When you are weary of the Emperor, you will always find a commission waiting for you in the service of the Marshal Millefleurs." That is the end of How the Brigadier Took the Field Against the Marshal Millefleurs, from The Exploits of Brigadier Gerard by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Read by Greg Wagland for Magpie Audio 2024. Please subscribe, comment positively or negatively, as you wish. And remember, if you want an Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes story, they're all on this channel. Seek and ye shall find, as they say, as is said. Au revoir.